Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this Bright Lights Online presentation. I'm Erin Greenwald from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, and this series is presented by Entergy. We're so happy that you could join us today. To give you a little background, every year since 1985, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities has recognized the individuals, institutions, and organizations who have contributed to the understanding of Louisiana's history and culture in our state. The Bright Lights Online program is an alternative to our typical annual awards ceremony, which we usually hold every spring as a very special event. But due to the current public health crisis, we're unable to do so. So we're bringing the awardees and their accomplishments to you. This presentation today is the second in the series. We hope you'll join us next week to recognize Champion of Culture awardee LSU Press. I'll be in conversation with Elisa Plant, who's the press director. On January 8th, we'll have another of our lifetime contributions to the humanities awardees. That's Linda and Brittany Langley from the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana, in conversation with Arizona State University professor and historian Denise Bates. We will wrap up the series on January 15th with the Michael P. Smith Memorial Award for Documentary Photography honoree Charles Lovell, who will be in conversation with Music Inside Out's Gwen Tompkins. This program will take place entirely over Zoom webinar, so you guys will all be able to see us. We can't see you, but we welcome your questions. You can go to the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You may have to hover over the bottom of your screen to pull it up. Once you pull it up, you can type in a question for Warren Perrin or Josh Caffery that we may address during the question and answer period. And okay, I'm going to start with the introductions. We have a wonderful moderator today who you guys are probably familiar with. Dr. Josh Caffery is a musician, teacher, and scholar. He's been director of the Center for Louisiana Studies and ULL Press at University of Louisiana at Lafayette since 2018. He's the author of the books Traditional Music in Coastal Louisiana, which is a study of some of the area's earliest field recordings, and In the Creole Twilight, a collection of poetry. Both of these are from LSU Press. His work with vernacular music in the area has earned him a Grammy nomination, or more than one Grammy nomination, as both a musician and a producer. He's also vice president of the Louisiana Folklorist Society. Welcome, Josh. Our 2020 Lifetime Contributions to the Humanities awardee, Warren Perrin, is a longtime supporter and defender of Cajun culture. A native of Vermilion Parish, one of Warren Perrin's most striking projects was his long but ultimately successful lobbying for recognition of the wrongs committed by the British Crown during the Acadian expulsion of 1755. Her Majesty Elizabeth II formally acknowledged those wrongs in 2003. I'm hoping that there will be a part in the Crown about this, but we'll see. With a proclamation recognizing July 28th as an annual day of commemoration. Perrin also established, along with Weldon Granger, the nonprofit Acadian Heritage and Culture Foundation, which operates the Acadian Museum in Arath, Louisiana. He's currently at work on a bid to gain UNESCO recognition of early Acadian settlements as World Heritage Sites, continuing his advocacy for the recognition and celebration of Cajun culture at the global level. Welcome, Josh and Warren.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thanks everyone for being here and tuning in. I guess I'll just start out by, well, thanks Warren, of course, for being here too. I'll start out by giving a little anecdote about when I first met Warren. It was when I was a young teenager, 14 or 15 years old, and I got to be friends with Warren's son, Andy. It's still friends with him today. And I met Warren, I believe, at his house, and I knew him as a dad. But if you know Warren, he's such an intense and passionate guy, and he's also, ripped and buff because he's a champion weightlifter, and so I just was kind of intimidated by you, Warren, early on, when I met you as a young guy. But you were just the nicest guy then, and then, as I've grown up and been involved in Louisiana culture, I learned that you weren't just this sort of buff dad, but you were also, a champion of culture and and a very amazing and impressive person in various ways. So, um, so let me start off by asking you just to kind of, for people who may not know too much, tell us about how your early days growing up in Vermilion Parish. Tell me about where you came from and some of the people you knew when you were young.
I grew up in the small hamlet of Henry, Louisiana, and I use Henry and Erath interchangeably because the first settlement was Banker on the Vermilion River, and that was abandoned pretty much when the railroad came through Erath. And so the people from the Banker Henry area created the town of Erath. So most of the people in the Henry Erath area, they're only a couple of miles apart, and it's all the same families. But when I was young, there were two schools. You had Erath High School and Henry High School. And Henry was the first high school in Vermilion Parish, and we were very proud of that. Although the population of the school dwindled to the point where when I graduated, there were only about 120 students from first through 12th grade. So I grew up in an extremely small school, but with a lot of support from a lot of people, influenced by a lot of neighbors, interesting people. Dudley Leblanc, the creator of Had a Call, was from Erath, had hired my great uncle. He would often visit my grandfather's house. I knew about his stories. Roy Terrio later became another Erath native, became mayor of Abbeville, started the Dairy Festival, his famous breakfasts in Baton Rouge promoting Cajun culture. And for me, it was the first time I got to see a President Truman was at a dairy festival when he came down to campaign for John Kennedy in Abbeville. He drew a crowd of 100,000 people. And I had gotten interested in politics and history and current events. So I was very impressed by these individuals that were promoting our area, not only nationally, but internationally.
Yeah. You mentioned when we talked earlier this week, some of the people who really impressed you early on, and you told me the story of your civics teacher, or then you said it was called Current Affairs, and how he introduced you kind of to a larger stage, or the idea of a larger stage. Could you tell us a little bit about him? Because I think it's kind of key to the sort of work that you did later on.
His name was Frank Hardy, and he had retired from the Air Force as a fighter pilot, and came to teach and coach us. We were so small, most teachers had dual or triple roles, and he was our basketball, track coach, history teacher, and current events civics teacher. And he just turned me on to the world scene. He had wonderful stories about being stationed all over the world. And he impressed upon us, and especially it affected me, to keep up with current events, because he'd keep telling us the current event of today is the history of tomorrow. So if you don't keep up with what's going on in the world, you won't know your history. And oftentimes I would interrupt basketball games or playing cowboys and Indians with my friends to run in the house and turn on the TV to watch Walter Cronkite, this 15-minute news telling me about the world. And so I've always been fascinated with keeping up. And when CNN was launched by Ted Turner, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And my wife, Mary, can tell you, to this day, I can sit down and watch CNN hours on end.
Well, when you were growing up, when you were a young boy, did people mostly speak Cajun French in your household and around Henry? Was it a combination of Cajun French and English?
Yes, the original settlers of that area were from Denmark, some Germans, and then the Cajuns came in, and as they did in most places, they pretty much co-opted the ethnicity of the region and came to dominate it. But yes, it was the common language, especially outside of the home. Now, I have an older brother, Terry, who was another big influence on me. He was only 5 years older than me, but he was born in right when my father left for World War II to go fight in the South Pacific. And Terry only spoke French when he started school.
Wow.
So Dad comes back and he'd often tell me, j'ai parti un Cajun, mais j'ai revenu un Américain, which meant when I left for the army, I was a Cajun. I came back an American. So all of these Cajun soldiers became, for the first time, felt part of America. And so when I was born in 47 as a baby boomer, Mom and Dad made a decision to not speak French to me in the home, but they still spoke French to Terry. So we were a bilingual table. But when we went outside to work in the rice field or to pick up hay or to cut sugarcane or to pick cotton, it was French. So it was kind of both, but they wanted me to be more American than Cajun.
That's interesting. It's kind of almost a dual identity. Did you have an idea then? Did you think in terms of Cajun? Was that a word that you were familiar with, and did you identify with it at the time?
Yes, I did. I recognized there was a lot of good in the culture. I understood that they were trying to keep it alive, but at the same time, 3/4 of me wanted to be a good little American boy. And I tried like the Dickens to give up my TH accent, this, that, and those, because I just didn't want to relate to that, because there was their baggage that we brought along with the culture of being unable to speak English meant you were in some way backwards or dumb, which of course we know is ridiculous. But anyway, as a young boy, I had that in the recesses of my mind. Correctly pronounce this, that, and those. To this day, I can't say tongue tack.
You mentioned your brother Terry, and when we talked earlier this week, you talked about what a great influence he was on you, particularly how he brought you into the world of weightlifting, which I don't know if people, I imagine most of the people in this seminar may know, but Warren went on to become a champion weightlifter, not bodybuilder. Warren corrected me, a weightlifter, not a bodybuilder. They're very different in college. And could you tell me about that? Because I think it's important for people to know that you were involved in weightlifting and heavy lifting. I think it actually speaks to your work in other arenas. Could you tell me a little bit about Terry and the early weightlifting days in Vermilion Parish and elsewhere?
Terry ordered a set of barbells from York, Pennsylvania, and changed my daddy's workshop into a workout room with pulleys and barbells and dumbbells and benches. And on any given afternoon or evening after school, we might have 30 boys from the neighborhood there trying to bulk up, trying to be like Steve Reeves and be stronger. Now, we used it for sports. You know, we were dedicated to basketball and track, but we were such a small school, we never really had a good winning record. In fact, my senior year in basketball, we only won 2 games. So, you know, it was difficult to develop a winning attitude given those circumstances in sports. But in weightlifting, you were not part necessarily of a team. It was you against gravity. And you had to learn that you had to make the weight or not be successful. It's not like running a 100-yard dash. You can run a 100-yard dash. You're going to make it 99.9% of the time. But in weightlifting, you might be lucky to complete a lift, a press, snatch, or clean and jerk. To break a record might only happen once a month. So it's continual positive attitude to work out, to eat right, to train with that positive attitude. So that gave me a lot because we won in weightlifting. Terry brought me along to the college meets. I won the state championships in high school. That helped me win the state track championships in the long jump because I had extremely strong legs through doing a lot of squats. So that certainly showed me an opportunity to compete nationally and internationally with anybody because I could do it in weightlifting. And I was proud to have been a part of 3 national collegiate weightlifting championship teams at USL in the 60s, where that team won 8 national championships in 12 years, a remarkable record.
It sounds like it was a pretty interesting international group of guys who were involved in that team as well.
Yes, one of the founders was an Asian American, another big influence in my life, Walter Amahara, who lives in Baton Rouge. He had Amahara's nursery, and he was the first SLI then lifter to win a national championship in 1957. What's interesting about Walter, as a 6-year-old boy, his family was interned in an internment camp during World War II. His family was uprooted from California, shipped by train to Arkansas, And so when they were released from the camp after the war, his family was given $250 until they could go home. And they chose instead to go to Baton Rouge. Walter was the first Asian American to attend SLI and the first to graduate. And so that story, he cries when he tells me how he was so well accepted as a Japanese. It was not, 57 was not far after the war, when the word Jap was still a pejorative and people would still look down. But the people of Lafayette and the Cajuns on our team accepted him as a brother, and he never forgot that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me that, you know, being involved in weightlifting and just, you mentioned earlier this week, it's you against the iron, or it's you against gravity, you know, and it seems to me that actually kind of is almost a metaphor or a microcosm of some of your other work. I mean, you're known for some heavy lifts, you know. I mean, first of all, you know, the work with the Queen and having the Queen apologize for the genocide, really, against the Acadians in the 18th century. Before we get into that, though, take us up through being a weightlifter in college, up through going to law school. How did you end up deciding to become a lawyer, and just tell us a little bit about that.
Growing up, both of my great grandfathers lived 1 mile apart in the rural area of Henry, and I knew both of them. And one of them had a large grocery store. The election machine was there; the people would go vote. So he was well respected and liked in the community. We could tell that. My other great grandfather, Aristide Broussard, was a cowboy, and he has the largest number of cattle, arguably at that time in the 1920s in Vermilion Parish. And he acquired about 3,000 acres of land for his cattle. But Texaco discovered an oil field at the Texaco Henry plant and leased 80 acres and built this huge gas recycling plant in his backyard. In our backyard, we had Texaco building a plant. But I grew up with stories of how we had been taken advantage of by oil companies. That was one thing I wanted to see if maybe I couldn't correct some of those wrongs. And in fact, I did amend that lease that he had signed for the 80-acre tract. They were paying him $1,600 a year. Once I got out of law school, I got them to amend it to pay a fair price. Instead of $1,600, they were paying $100,000 a year for an 80-acre plant. Right. So that's number one. Number two, though, I had some great teachers in high school that urged me to go to law school. And one urged me to participate in Parish Government Day, run for district attorney. We put on these mock trials, and I loved it. I loved it. It was like weightlifting. It was combat. You know, there was no in between. There wasn't a draw. You won or you lost. And so I decided I was going to go to LSU, and that was just a wonderful experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think you told me a story once a couple of years ago about running across, was it Dudley Leblanc when you were in law school? Did you work for him perhaps, or he maybe helped you get a job? Is there, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. Cousin Dud, as he was affectionately known, was just a man beyond anybody of the time. He had this radio show where he could sway 30 to 40,000 votes. It was every Sunday at noon, and the kids had to go play outside because all the men would sit around a radio and listen to him. And what he would do is he'd open in French and he'd say, "I'm going to give y'all the nouvelles de la jour," the news of the day. But all he would do, he would read the captions of the front page of the newspaper. Okay, and that would last about 30 seconds. And then he would deep dive into local politics. And it was a regional show. And so he could swing voters from Thibodaux to Lake Charles. And he would endorse everybody from president to dog catcher. So you were always wanting to know who Cousin Dud was going to endorse that day. And we don't know. Sometimes he was persuaded by contributions of money. Otherwise, we never knew what side of the fence he was going to be on. So when I was in law school, I had married Mary Broussard, and she started teaching, and we needed another job. to supplement our income. So I went to see Cousin Dud. But now, he didn't know my face when I approached him in the Senate. He said, I had to give him my genealogy to make sure he knew the political side of my family was not against it. Otherwise, I'd have never gotten a meeting with him. Once he confirmed that I was in the right side of the Democratic Party, they had two parties in Vermilion Parish, the Machin and the Home Rule. And so the Machin was Huey Long people, and the Home Rule were anti-Long. So my family was on the right side as far as he saw, and he said, I hear you want a little job. I said, I do. And he leaned over and he said, do you want to show up or no? I said, I don't mind showing up. So he got me a nice, cushy job, which I showed up for every day working at the Insurance Rating Commission.
That's great. And Cousin Dud, I get in some ways, in addition to, what he's known for as a politico and hadacol, was to some degree a promoter of Cajun culture, an early kind of forerunner of that as well.
Undoubtedly. The last book Mary and I wrote, Seeking an Acadian Nation, one of the men that's not known today, he died in 1928, was Judge Joseph Breaux, a judge from New Iberia, who became Supreme Court Chief Justice. He was head of the first Louisiana school board. He had no children and a lot of money. And he spent the better part of his life reconnecting the Cajuns of Louisiana with the Acadians of the world. And he did this from 1860, after he got out of the Civil War, 1865, until 1901. He went for the first time to a reunion in Canada of Acadians. And so when he got too old to carry on, he passed the torch to Dudley Leblanc. And Dudley picked it up in 1930 and brought the first group of Evangeline girls back to Canada. And he did this on 3 occasions. Now, he brought large groups in 1936 and 1963. He had enough political power to be received at the White House by Presidents Hoover, Roosevelt, and Kennedy for day-long picnics.
Wow.
He could sway votes, and the Democratic Party, they knew this. And so one of the girls who went on the 63 trip was my third cousin and classmate in Henry. Her name was Brenda Thibodeau. And so I knew this was going on. I wasn't intimately involved, but I knew it was swirling around me. There was this thing going on, and Dudley Leblanc was the leader of that movement from 1930 until really Cotefield got going when Jimmy DiMaggio took it on his shoulders to create Cotefield in 1968.
In talking to you yesterday, you mentioned that you didn't really know too much about Cotefield until you ultimately got drafted to be the president of Cotefield. Could you tell us a little bit about your kind of cultural awakening, if you can call it that, or how you really became immersed as an ambassador and a cultural advocate?
The first was the movie that my law firm produced, Belisaire the Cajun, which was directed and written by Glenn Peake, but my law partner, Alan Durand Jr., was really the man that put the deal together, so to speak, through our law firm. We were the general partners. So that was an interesting 3 years in the mid-'80s. It ultimately was released, I think, in 1985. Critical success, won many awards. That sort of got me into the French Bar Association, attending seminars in France, in Canada, and Judge Alan Babineau was really the one that got that going. Now, Judge Babineau was on the Cotefield board. He was very good friends with many of the early movers and shakers of the program, and often told me how the civil rights movement of the African Americans really inspired these people to get the civil rights of the Acadians recognized. So it was inspired by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So he was on the board, and he would bring me up to Canada with him and then ask me to host a couple of seminars. And it just, from there, he got me involved in attending a meeting. And the second president following Jimmy DiMaggio was Dr. John Bertrand of Crowley. He was ready to retire. And at that meeting, they told me in the bathroom and said, we heard what you're doing about getting an apology for the Acadians, and we need some young blood. We need some advocacy here. We need to spark new life in the movement. And I was honored to be asked to serve as president, and I went on to serve for 16 years under 4 governors.
Oh. Well, let's backtrack a little bit to talk about the case against the Queen, which so many people know you for. It just seems mind-boggling to me. How do you even go about conceptualizing, getting an apology from a monarch across the Atlantic Ocean from another country? I mean, we can't even seem to get apologies from our politicians for something that happened last month. But how do you do that when it's something that happened 200 years ago? How do you wrap your mind around it?
If you think back, Josh, the late 80s, we were moving into a decade of world peace. The Berlin Wall came down in 89. In 88, President Reagan issued an apology to the Japanese Americans for their internment in World War II. And I had been told a story by Walter Amahara of horror, of being uprooted, of being deported. And I could relate to that as an Acadian. And a light bulb went out in my head one day, and it said, wait a minute. It's the same thing they did to my ancestors that America did to the Japanese Americans. We got to do something about this. And so I started talking to people, professors, law professors, historians, Dr. Carl Brasser, Dr. Barry Ancelet. But I could have been stopped at any point because I knew it would be very controversial. It could never have come from Canada. It had to come from Louisiana because at that time, the French-English relations were very strained. You had the Quebec movement beginning to pull out of Canada. So it had to come from a Cajun. But I got a lot of support from experts in Canada that urged me to do it, but I could never use their names because it could affect them in business or in their professional lives. Mm-hmm. But one in particular stands out because I met him. Dr. Michel Doucet was a professor of law at Moncton University. He and I became close friends for the next 40 years. And he could have stopped me. If he had said, don't do it, I would not have done it. But he said, go for it. You're right. It's going to take a long time, but it needs to be done. The second person who could have stopped me was my wife, Mary. And she said, go for it. When I told my parents, my mother cried and my daddy thought I'd lost my mind because Cajuns, as you know, Josh, don't want to rock the boat. It's like rocking the boat got us kicked out of Nova Scotia. Let's not do this again. So it was always be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. Well, I was never that kind of person. I was one to rattle the cage, make some noise, take a stand. And so I studied the issue for 2 years. And I found this petition that Dudley Leblanc had found, and it's an appendix of his book, Acadian Miracle, where a petition was prepared in 1763 by Acadians who had been deported to Philadelphia. And they petitioned the king, and they sent 2 ministers to present it to him, arguing the wrong that had been committed to them. And I said, there it is. I don't have to create a new petition. I'm going to make the Crown answer that petition. Mm-hmm. So I prepared a lawsuit and I attached that petition to the lawsuit. And I said, you have never answered it and you will answer it. I'll give you 30 days. I sent a letter by courier to Margaret Thatcher, 10 Downing Street, and to Buckingham Palace. And I gave them 30 days or the lawsuit was going to be filed in federal district court in Lafayette. On the 28th day, I was contacted by the British ambassador's office, and he said, we have retained lawyers in Houston. Do not file the suit. We will be in touch. And that led to a series of negotiations culminating in the signing in 2003. It took about 13 years for it to happen, but the Royal Proclamation was signed on December 9th, 2003.
It's an interesting thing, and amazing to me how you've been able to combine your career as an advocate, a cultural advocate, but then also as an avocat, as a lawyer working on behalf of other people. it, could you tell me a little bit about after that happened, after you obtained that apology from the Queen? It seems like, and you also were ultimately worked with Codafil as the president. You became more well known as a cultural ambassador, I think, for our area. You know, you told me a little bit about some of your travels overseas. For instance, to Vietnam and with President Chirac. Could you tell us a little bit about that next phase of your career when you really emerged as a well-known champion on an international stage for the culture?
Timing is everything, and just as the peacetime during the 90s led to the apology, where countries were looking introspectively at their histories and acknowledging wrongs, the francophone culture of the world, there's about 55 nations that consider themselves based on the francophone culture, but they had never united like the British Empire had united. The British had been having their own sports events, cultural events, supporting each other. But Jacques Chirac conceived of the idea of having La Francophonie, which is a supporting organization, and he launched it in the 90s. And I was able to attend the first 5 conferences representing Louisiana and the United States. Interestingly, I was one of the first Americans to return to Hanoi when diplomatic relations had not been reestablished, because I went as a member of the French delegation at the invitation of President Chirac on his private plane, equivalent of Air Force One. And when I was coached by the French to be extremely careful, don't joke, because they're going to be, he said, the Vietnamese will think you are CIA. So just don't take any chances. I said, I got you, I understand. And on that flight, which took about 16 hours, we had a chance to visit. Chirac came sit down next to me and in perfect English told me how he spent a year studying for his master's degree in economics in New Orleans. And he wrote his dissertation on the port of New Orleans. So he knew Louisiana very well. And he told me where he lived on Burgundy Street in the French Quarter. He rented an apartment from Dr. Dupuy. And he said, by the way, the first time my picture appeared in the newspaper, it was in the Times-Picayune. I said, well, why were you in the newspaper? He said, because I took a job driving a taxi cab. And they did a story on a French taxi cab driver in New Orleans. And he said, can you get me a copy of that article? I lost it. So I did. We sent it to him. He autographed it, and it's probably on display in the Codafil office today. But that trip to Vietnam was phenomenal. I mean, it was just an amazing experience. Since then, we went to Bucharest, we went to Quebec City, we went to Paris, and we went to Moncton. Mm-hmm. And so that just opens your eyes to the world. And of course, all of that was helping me gain respect to get the petition done, because it was in Vietnam. I was given a brief 15-minute meeting with Prime Minister Chrétien, Canada, where I argued that the Canadian government should get behind the petition. And he agreed. And about 2 years later, because of Chrétien's intervention, the royal proclamation was concluded.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned, and I think the audience might be interested to hear about this when we talked earlier, and it's been in the news, your work obtaining the apology on an international stage also brought other clients, I suppose, your way, other people who needed and were seeking your help for big cases, heavy lifts, kind of returning to the metaphor at the beginning. And one is the recent case against Iran, the government of Iran, in the case of Blackie Trahan's son, Lex. Could you just tell us briefly a little bit about that and what the status of that is right now?
Well, a lot of the lawyers that advertise a lot on TV, every time they see me, they say, Warren, you're smarter than us. You don't advertise, you don't pay for your advertisement. You just promote the culture, and that's how people know you. And in a sense, they're correct, because it was a love of the culture that motivated me to do this. But of course, the spinoff was I attracted a lot of potential cases. to sue big oil companies for wetlands, for contamination, for taking oil royalties from wetlands. But the Blackie Tronho case is unique in that it's clearly because of my cultural work. I was doing a talk to a genealogy group, and Blackie Tronho and his wife were there and came up to me and said, "Since you're not afraid to sue the Queen, would you be willing to sue Iran?" And I said, "Well, let's talk." And their son was killed in 1983 in Beirut when the terrorists funded by the Islamic regime then in control of Iran killed 253 Marines, blowing up their barracks. And after 9/11, the United States government created a special court, special law. There are countries listed as terrorist regimes. And if anyone is hurt or injured or killed because of actions of any of these countries, they have a special right to sue in this court in Washington, D.C., which is what I did. It took nearly a decade, but ultimately we got, I believe, one of the largest judgments, or right under $50 million for the death of a 19-year-old boy, Blackie Tronho's son, Lex Tronho.
That's incredible.
I might mention where people hear of companies being fined by international courts. Recently, an oil tanker, an Iranian oil tanker, was seized for violating the orders of importation to certain countries. The money that's generated goes into the fund that pays off the judgments because of this terrorist activity. So when the president puts sanctions against a country, ultimately that money is used to pay if they hurt any people or kill anybody. I just thought that would be interesting for the people to know.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about, we have about 5 or 6 minutes left before we go into the Q&A, is I know that you have a partner in crime, your wife Mary, who's really been with you in all of your cultural endeavors, and she's been, you know, behind you and with you in all these heavy lifts over the years. Could you just tell me a little bit tell us a little bit about Mary and the sort of collaborative nature of your work?
Yeah, the first time I went to a party on the campus, it was a sorority fraternity rush party, and I met Mary, and we were both freshmen at USL then, and we started dating and dated for 4 years and then got married right after USL days. But her father was Alton Broussard. He was a professor of journalism. Mm-hmm. He was very involved in the culture. I learned a lot from him. He would do many, many articles for the Daily Advertiser and the Slimco magazine. And he became a special feature writer. And he and my mother-in-law went to visit Grand Pré. I didn't know what Grand Pré was. I mean, so I would learn a lot from my father-in-law. And Mary, of course, was involved in art. She put her career on hold and went into teaching when I went into LSU Law School. And she taught deaf kids art. And then ultimately she got her master's degree in fine arts later on. And so we have worked collaboratively on all of our books. We've published 9 books, some separately, some together. The last 2, we've done it together, one with the help of Phil Como from Montreal, Canada. And presently she's working on a book for the Center for Louisiana Studies, a little organization you know a little bit about healing traditions of Acadiana. And in fact, she's doing some research upstairs right now as we speak. And I'm working on another book independently on one of my weightlifting comrades, David Berger.
Tell us briefly about that. I think it's interesting. You're writing a story about David Berger, who was a Jewish American man who was killed in what year was it? 1972 in a terrorist attack at the Munich Olympics. It might be strange for some people to know that Warren, who's so identified with Cajun culture, is writing a story about a Jewish man as a weightlifter, but I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, I think there are a lot of analogies to be drawn between Jewish culture and Acadian culture, ethnic pride and identity. Could you just briefly tell us about that project?
I met David at a weightlifting meet because he was from Cleveland, Ohio, but attending Tulane. He was a brilliant student, getting double major, and he loved weightlifting as I did. And we were competitors initially. We were in the same weight class of weightlifting, the 165-pound class. And there's a lot of downtime at these early weightlifting meets. A meet could last 12 hours. So you had a lot of downtime to visit and get to know your competitors and your friends and just talk. So he was the first Jewish person I ever met. I was the first Cajun. His French was impeccable. He was a French minor. And we started, he had never heard of a Cajun, and we could both speak French. He was a French minor too. And we started talking about deportation, how our peoples had been treated similar. The British, had deported us, and of course the Jewish people have been submitted to many deportations over their history. And he could speak beautiful French. And so there's a lot of downtime at these weightlifting meets, and we became friends over the next few years. I could never defeat him. He beat me every time we competed, but we were very good friends. And we both had this goal to represent our country at the Olympics. He succeeded, but the way he did it, he immigrated to Israel after he graduated from Tulane. He went get 2 degrees at New York University, and at age 26, he immigrated and he became a Jewish citizen. It's called kiva. And he did this to be on the Jewish Olympic team and compete in the Olympics. I had the same dream to go to the Olympics, but instead I married Mary Broussard and I gave up lifting when I left USL. But we were following his career. All of us here in Lafayette, in Louisiana, we all knew David Berger so well. And so he was representing us. He was our guy at the Olympics. So at bated breath, we were waiting for him to lift. And he lifted, and sadly, 3 days later, and it happens to be on a September 5th, the same day that the Acadian deportation started, September 5th, David was killed by the Black September group that invaded the Olympic Village in Munich, Germany, held him hostage, along with 11 members of the Israeli team, and brutally tortured. He was one of the main characters in the film Steven Spielberg did called Munich, because he resisted, and they shot him twice, and they tortured him, and ultimately he was killed by a grenade when there was an attempt to rescue. So that's the book I'm writing now. It's very emotional. I'm in touch with his family. They're sharing all the stories. I have his scrapbooks as a young boy, as a college student, and I hope to publish it on the anniversary of his death, which would be in 2022.
Oh, that's great. Well, we're almost to the Q&A portion of this. Let me ask you one more question, though, before we move on. I know you have some beautiful grandchildren. I know Henry and Louis and Nicolene, and I'm wondering, in your mind, what are some of the challenges of passing on Acadian and Cajun culture to future generations as you see it? You've been doing the heavy lifting all this time, and you're at a point where you're obviously very busy, but you're nearing retirement, maybe from some of this at least. But what are some of the challenges you see kind of on the horizon, and maybe your thoughts about how we can not drop the potato, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I just recently reread, Dr. Dorman wrote a beautiful book about the people called Cajuns, and he wrote this in the early 80s, just after the beginning of the French Renaissance, which of course started in the late 60s. And he was making observations about what does the future look like. And a lot of what he wrote in that book have the same sentiments today. Of course, we're always going to have setbacks and struggles, and they're going to continue. But for the most part, we have victories. We have French immersion now, which developed extremely successfully over the years. because of Codafil's efforts and the support. And so now we have this younger generation coming up and lighting new fires, opening new doors. And I just think I'm chronically optimistic that it's going to continue. It's going to evolve. As Dewey Balfour says, it's going to change. If you don't change, you die. It's going to have to go in different ways. There's discussions going on in the culture about do we call Cajuns Creoles or we don't? And, you know, all of that's good because it makes you focus on what you need to do to go into the future, because that future becomes your past. And I was blessed to have some wonderful mentors, and I hope that we can have enough that develop through the French immersion program to keep the culture promoting in a positive way, because it's a beautiful thing that we have in Louisiana. It's something that, and I often discussed this with David Berger before he died. There were 18 million Jews. A third were extinguished in the Holocaust. There were about 18,000 Acadians, and we lost about the same percentage in our Holocaust. But both of our cultures endured ethnic cleansing and genocide. And I have great hope for the future that we're going to be around for a long, long time.
Thanks. I have and it actually ties into what you were just saying. I have a question from Dr. Nick Spitzer at Tulane, the host of American Roots. He's chimed in with a question via Facebook. He asks, the impact of the civil rights movement on Cajuns is paralleled in many other ethnic groups in American life. You talked about how Judge Babineau and others were influenced by the civil rights movement. Could you speak to the cultural and social relationships among Cajuns and Afro-French Creoles in South Louisiana, and the latter's concern for civil rights and cultural signification? That's a complex question, but I guess one way we can get to it is by talking about relationships between Afro-Creoles and Cajuns. Perhaps when you were growing up, what did you what African Americans and Afro-Creole people did you encounter growing up in and around Henry, and how do you think today about relationships between Acadians and Cajuns and Afro-Creoles? I know you recently wrote about some of the shared trials and tribulations those people have faced.
I had a grandfather who always had an African American working for him, and I would work in the fields with him. And I was a teenager, and he was about 5 years older than me, but we became pretty close over the years. And he would share things with me that I would have never normally experienced learning the African American experience had I not been friends with William Darby. And I had no contact with African Americans growing up in our little area. Of course, the schools were segregated, but through his eyes, it made me see better what the relationship between the races lacked and how it needed to be improved. I learned a lot from him, telling me different things over the years. And of course, I had no idea that Acadians had owned slaves. That's something nobody talked about. It was just assumed that, you know, whites were better than blacks, you know, that kind of thing. But in doing research, I learned that my 7th generation ancestor, Amon Broussard, who was Beausoleil Broussard's son, had a large number of slaves right around on the Bayou Teche around Loreauville. And we know that through his estate. I've read his descriptive list of his succession estate. And although it was reported that he was very benevolent, nevertheless, he was a slave owner. And so that's a sin that we can't overlook that. It's been whitewashed. And I was moved to write a letter to the editor a few months ago expressing the fact that until you have recognition of the wrongs that Acadians participated in inflicting subjugation against blacks, there can never be true reconciliation. Mm-hmm. That was well received, but for the most part, in the response I got from people.
Mm-hmm. We have another somewhat related question, which says, It's from an anonymous attendee. How does the ancestral experience of exile affect Cajun identity today? Are there cultural tendencies you see as related to this history? And, you know, you recently wrote a great article, I think it was in the Daily Advertiser, about how African Americans and Acadians and you could even say, you know, you're thinking of your interest in and your friend David Berger, Jewish people as well have a shared history to some degree of diaspora and exile. How does that, in the words of this question, are there cultural tendencies you see as related to this history? Are there things in our culture that that respond to a history of being exiled people? You mentioned earlier that you thought of Cajuns as somewhat conservative and not rocking the boat. At the same time, there's the history of Beausoleil Broussard, who I believe is an ancestor of yours who did rock the boat. Tell me a little bit about that question. You know, did that experience of exile, does it affect our culture today, and how?
Yeah, I think so. It was Dr. Carl Broussard who wrote that people incorrectly believe that the Cajun culture is monolithic, which is totally wrong. I mean, you had upper class Cajuns and you had lower class Cajuns and you had middle class Cajuns, all different denominations in between. And it was the case initially, and it's still the case today. So for me, yes, I always felt deep down in my DNA, I better not mess up because bad things can happen to you. Now, was that my teacher in school making me do my homework? Or was it mom and dad making me do my chores? Combinations of all of that, perhaps. But it's clear that beside the Mormon people, the Mormons, the Acadians are the best documented people on earth because we were documented when we arrived, when we were deported, we were treated like cattle. And then when we arrived, we were documented. And when we changed our money, we were documented. So when we got Spanish land grants, we were documented. And we didn't move for the most part. We're also placent people. We were in France. We were in Nova Scotia for 250 years. And we've been in South Louisiana for 260 years. So we have a very staid, organized culture. The bounds are limitless. I mean, the borders are very, very erratic. Who's a Cajun? Who's not a Cajun? Who's a Creole? There's a big discussion going on right now about that. Mm-hmm. And I like to be inclusive. I like to think if there's a doubt, then you're in. Mm-hmm. There shouldn't be a doubt, you're out. You should be accepted because every time an Acadian mingled with a different culture, he usually ended up dominating it through his culture. I mean, when we did the study of my little hometown of Erath with Dr. Bob Carricker, did research on the book we did in 1999, we thought Erath, it was called the most Cajun place on earth. When we started looking beneath the surface, the founder was in Switzerland, August Erath. His partner was Patrick O'Toole from Ireland. The largest family were Germans, the Sweers. The Cajuns were late comers, but Erath is a Cajun place. So we have overcome a lot, and I think there'll be a lot to overcome, but we have the ability to deal with it as it comes our way and adjust. Adaptability has been our secret.
It's interesting, you know, Cajuns have passed through so many trials and tribulations and been denigrated and went through a phase of denigration. But then, you know, in the 70s and 80s, there was a huge revival of interest in Cajun culture. As Barry Onsley sometimes says, Cajun became sexy, you know, not that it ever wasn't, you know, but this anonymous attendee asks, how did people in your parents' generation react to the increasing interest and celebration of Cajun culture? What did it seem, in your opinion, to people out in Henry and Erath when all of a sudden in the 80s there was sort of this rush of mass interest in the culture, you know, that to some degree continues today?
I will say that my parents were never actively involved in any cultural movement whatsoever. However, I could hear them talking and they liked what was going on around them. You know, they liked what Jimmy DiMaggio was doing and Judge Babineau. And when Barry Ossolet convinced Jimmy DiMaggio to host the tribute to Cajun music in 1974 at Blackham Coliseum, my parents and their friends were there in a driving rainstorm. It was like a call to arms. It was the first time they felt they were invited to participate. Before that, there was more of genteel idealism of Acadians when they celebrated the bicentennial of deportation in 1955. The word Cajun could not be spoken or written. It could only be Acadian, genteel. They were going back to the myth of Evangeline. And so that event, that 1974 music event, was just so important. And it created that interest that the local people like my parents, who didn't get beyond 8th grade, felt part of the larger movement. And then, of course, 84, you had the World's Fair. That was a game changer, because that's when your artist, your Blue Dog, George Rodriguez, became well known. That's when Paul Prudhomme and his cooking skills became known. And that's when Cajun sort of exploded on the international scene. And then 10 years later, 94, we have the first World Acadian reunion. So timing is everything. I was lucky to come into the movement at just the time it was starting to really explode and get larger and become more international.
Okay. We have about time for one more question, and I'll give a little bit of context. You mentioned that Cajuns, in your mind, were people who liked being in place. They had kind of a cultural gravity. You know, they had these giant dislocations and relocations over time from Acadie to here, from France to Acadie. And it's interesting at the same time, now some of the land that Cajuns are so tied to is in some ways endangered by land loss and climate change. And I know you're involved in that just in various ways. Living in Henry, I'm from Franklin, you know, we're seeing the water creep up down there every day. Brandon Champagne has this question. How does the issue, and this will be our last question, how does the issue of land loss impact Cajun identity, and what can we do about it?
That's a very difficult question, but I can tell you it's an important one, because I got involved in representing landowners who lost marshland under the old Louisiana Civil Code. When land goes underwater, it's lost to the state. It becomes navigable. If it's navigable, water bottoms belong to the state of Louisiana, whether they were water bottoms 200 years ago or whether they're going to be water bottoms next year. They belong to the state. You lose title. And so we have thousands of acres of lands that are underwater now. And until the last decade, the state of Louisiana was not trying to claim that from private landowners, but they started about 10 years ago, and we fought them in one of the first successful lawsuits. We represented the Thibodeau family. And of course, they found oil, and so the state wanted to come in and claim the oil, because if you own the water bottom, then the state owns the oil that's produced from that. So one of the things you don't see discussed, you see a lot about spending money to save the marshland. What you don't see anybody talking about is who's going to own the land. Is the state going to ultimately fess up and let landowners keep title, or are they going to try to claim it all? So watch for that in the coming years. That's going to be a big, big issue.
All right. Well, yeah, as Randy Newman sang, they're trying to wash us away, you know, but thank God we have people like Warren Perrin to do the heavy lifting, you know, to keep our heads above water. Thank you to everyone who took part in this call, and thank you so much, Warren, and thank you for having this talk with me, and congratulations on this this well-earned Lifetime Achievement Award. And I think Aaron is going to come on and tie things up for us.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
No, merci à vous, Warren. We're so happy to be able to host you guys today. Thank you all who are watching for bearing with us in our virtual environment. I think it went really well, and we appreciate both of you, Josh and Warren, for joining us today. We hope to see all of you at our future Bright Lights Online programs. You can find more information about them at the LEH website, leh.org. Thanks, everybody.